Do you know what peace sounds like, Lieutenant? It sounds like doors locking behind you, and no one reacting. Director Halron Mech didn't look away from the chamber's panoramic transparency as he spoke. The hexagonal panels shimmered faintly with refracted daylight from Elton V's twin suns, tinting his features with subtle hues of rose and pale amber. His fingers rested lightly on the table's edge, nails trimmed short, wrists relaxed. Yet beneath the composure was a stillness too deliberate to be called calm. Lieutenant Tarek Varan adjusted his collar and cleared his throat, unsure if Mech was waiting for a reply or simply thinking aloud. "I suppose peace feels quieter than this," he muttered. Mech's brow lifted a fraction. "No. Peace doesn't feel quiet, it feels unfinished." Outside, the sound of local wildlife filtered through the insulated chamber vents. Sharp-pitched calls and rhythmic buzzes of winged creatures nesting in the arched flora. Even through several layers of atmospheric filtration, the air held a sweetness, humid and mineral-rich, the scent of recent rainfall clinging to every surface. Eltan V, despite its political volatility, offered a sort of deceptive charm, a calm too orderly to trust. The chamber was massive, shaped like a converging spiral. Light panels embedded into the floor cycled through the flags of attending accord-aligned systems. A shallow table, constructed from compressed talcium ore, sat at the center, glowing faintly with internal charge. The Varn delegation arrived first. They moved with ceremonial stiffness, clad in deep maroon robes trimmed in obsidian thread weave. Their augment ports were disguised beneath collars and cuffs, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Mech did. He had seen them during the preliminary sessions, even when they insisted they weren't active. The leader among them, Envoy Trask Laron, inclined his head in the Varn greeting. Right hand flat to sternum, left behind the back. A symbol of disclosure. A lie, Mech thought. "We appreciate the gesture of trust, Director Mech," Liron said, his voice thin and low, like a polished reed being flexed too far. "Your delegation's ceremonial escort speaks to your belief in our shared purpose." Mech's smile was tight. "Trust is best tested in small rooms." The Terran delegation was unarmed, by design. No sidearm, no defense mesh, no kinetic sheath. Just the standard diplomatic seal embedded into their breastplates and the data scroll with the Tossium proposal stored inside. This summit was monitored by the Galactic Accord Authority, neutral ground. In theory, Mech sat. He adjusted the data scroll on the table before him, its interface glowing as it synced with the local system. He could feel the faint tremor of the planet's orbit stabilizers adjusting deep beneath the surface, like someone breathing through stone. Laron sat across from him, eyes steady. The rest of the Varn Council spread out with eerie synchronicity, each taking their place as though orchestrated. Mech tapped the scroll. A layout of proposed Tausium zones appeared on the chamber's laser plasma display. "We've mapped the yield potential across 8 asteroid belts. If the Dominion concedes access to corridors A7 and B9, Earth's refining stations will process within 5 cycles, and will return 50% yield through secured freighter lanes." Laron leaned forward. "And if we refuse?" There was no surprise in the question, only finality. "You won't," Mech said, not as a threat, but as an inevitable conclusion. "Your orbital fleet can't sustain full-scale harvesting. Our assistance ensures both prosperity and balance." The chamber lights flickered. Just once. The air changed. Not temperature, not pressure, but something in the way it moved. Mech noticed it instantly, the way the Varn Council members straightened, the way their hands fell to the edge of the table in unison. Their sleeves slid back just enough to reveal the sheen of embedded tech, augments optical, muscular, subdermal. Laron stood abruptly. 2 Varn counselors moved in the same second. One reached beneath the table. From beneath the Varn envoy's sleeve, a vector blade snapped out, humming with internal flux. The sound it made was too sharp for the ears alone. It reverberated inside the skull like teeth grinding glass. Mech didn't flinch. "You're making a grave mistake," he said, his voice steady even as the blade rose. Laren's face twitched, not with hesitation, but with something colder. Satisfaction. The vector blade entered Mech's throat in a clean arc. No scream, just a shudder, a brief flicker of resistance, and the thud of flesh against polished metal. Varen lunged, knocking his chair backward. He caught one of the attackers by the arm, twisting hard, bone cracked, elbow hyperextended. But before he could turn, a shock lance surged through his spine, dropping him to the ground, convulsing. Blood spilled down Mech's front in narrow rivulets, staining the seal of Earth's diplomatic insignia. He remained upright for a second longer, then collapsed forward over the data scroll. The system interface blinked twice, unresponsive. The laser plasma display remained active. Unbeknownst to the Varn, the entire broadcast was live. Accord Authority protocols mandated full-spectrum coverage of diplomatic summits across all open systems. Fringe worlds, neutral sectors, non-aligned stations, every corner of the Accord's web saw the moment Halron Mech died. And just before the feed cut, one frame lingered. Mech's body slumped forward, blood trailing in a thin smear over the Earth insignia, eyes open, jaw slack. Then static. No one spoke on the Accord floor. No retractions, no denouncements. The Authority's neutrality clause required consensus to authorize intervention. The Varn used that clause to shield themselves from immediate consequence, and Earth, at least publicly, said nothing. But in the cold heart of Earth's strategic command, buried beneath the ice crust of Rausch 3, a lone technician entered an authorization string into the Echo Key terminal. The screen displayed, Echo 5 contingency, confirm protocol execution, confirm, abort. The confirmation key required no second input. At 3:48 Terran Universal, Earth's diplomatic network went offline. Every embassy across known systems initiated quiet exit protocols. Doors locked, documents burned, staff vanished. Commander Alric Vor stood at the window of Subdeck 6, eyes fixed on the tactical feeds as mobilization signals pulsed across the grid. "Diplomats wear badges," he said to the room, voice flat. "Soldiers carry closure." He turned to his staff. "Bring me the Aegis line." And the screen, without ceremony or flourish, turned red. The silence after the broadcast wasn't accidental. It wasn't shock. It was loading time. Beneath the polar crust of Rausch 3, far removed from the diplomatic corridors of Eltan-V, the subglacial servers of Earth's Strategic Command lit up with tasking signals that bypassed advisory review. The transmission of Mech's execution, Tanto Stetchet stamped, Tomt authenticated, distributed through every Accord-monitored relay, was archived within seconds. The kill had not been denied. It had been displayed. Commander Alric Vor stood at the elevated tier of the strategic theater, his coat still stiff from cold storage reactivation, shoulders square, gaze locked to the centered tier display where orbital data pulsed across shifting tactical grids. One of his aides had asked, softly, stupidly, if they would wait for a vote. "There's no vote," Vor had replied, eyes unreadable. "There's protocol," and across 17 systems, protocol began. Quiet exit protocols weren't designed for extraction, they were for erasure. On Letha Station, Earth's diplomatic suite was found empty 3 hours after Mech's assassination. Place settings on the long table still held steam. The walls bore no sign of struggle, but the local security feed was wiped frame by frame, and every datapad in the Terran quarter had been flash-burnt to raw silicon. In the Briarfold orbit, a Terran console's shuttle failed to report in. Accord vessels investigating found its hangar bay vented and the local drive core fused by controlled overload. The ship's ambassadorial markings had been scrubbed. Only a single phrase remained stenciled into the inner bulkhead with etched alloy. "This channel is now closed." Earth's embassies didn't fall back, they evaporated. On the diplomatic channels once flooded with routine trade negotiations and transit notices, there were now only error pings. Subspace handshake failed. Session expired. Encryption loop incomplete. Silence. Without declaration. For every ally waiting on Earth's response, nothing came. No condemnation, no retaliation request, not even acknowledgement. Across the Accord's central information banks, automated Terran entries ceased at once. Council dockets arrived with blank lines under Earth's delegation slot. That quietness unnerved even Earth's friends. Without guidance, speculation festered. Some believed it was a ploy, Earth-building suspense for dramatic leverage. Others thought the Terran Senate had fractured. A few simply believed the humans were stunned. The Varn High Seat issued a message 6 hours after the broadcast, draped in conciliatory language, blaming the event on unvetted military extremists and disavowing the action as an unauthorized escalation during high-stakes negotiation. No one believed them. But no one moved either, because Earth hadn't spoken. Inside the hardened bunkers of Rausch 3, Commander Vor studied the stress patterns across the Accord's major transit corridors. Every jump relay from Sol was now under controlled throttle. Ships weren't blocked, they were diverted, traffic rerouted, manifests reclassified, and long-range beacons saturated with low-level jamming tones that mimicked routine carrier drift. But beneath that coverage, something was moving. Pull the Aegis line from Urith. Vor's voice was even, yet the officers in the chamber responded with something close to unease. Stagger deployment along lateral insertion vectors. I want motion inside the drift bands by tomorrow. His operations chief, Major Kieran Dessen, looked up from the triangulation table. Sir, that's a 6-day reposition for half the formation. We'll push the relays past tolerance. They'll hold, Vor cut in. If they don't, we weren't building to last anyway. The room quieted. No one in Earth's command structure questioned Echo 5's logic. It wasn't about territory. It wasn't even about mech. It was about structure. Earth's diplomatic codebook, ratified 3 decades ago, contained only one absolute trigger. Lethal action taken during authorized negotiation invalidates diplomatic continuity across all actors. Not subject to evaluation, invalidates. That clause hadn't been activated in 57 years. Vor had reviewed it during training once. Most assumed it existed to remind allies what Earth wouldn't tolerate. No one expected it to be real. But now, as the chamber's display reorganized to show the phased routing of Terran combat formations through the L10 Drake corridor, no one questioned how real it had become. Update all non-diplomatic mission headers, Vor said. Rescind identification beacons. File all movement under transit support protocols. You want us flying dark through active Accord sectors? Dessen's voice carried the tension of someone trying not to sound incredulous. I want us flying unregistered through Accord sectors. That's not the same thing. Vor descended to the central deck, boots echoing softly against the floor. The chamber smelled faintly of ionized air and recycled carbon. Ross 3's filtration systems always left a trace of miner's dust in the upper circulation. Across the far wall, a tactical map rotated to show the Varn Dominion's exterior defense grid. Several orbital installations had gone active, their power signatures surging in anticipation of siege. Var's eyes tracked them one by one. They think we're still deciding, he said, half to himself. Outside the chamber, movement quickened. Support ships began uncoupling from their deep dock clamps. Engineer crews reviewed the weapon arrays. No dramatics, just careful recalibration. They wouldn't be broadcasting their intentions. They would be shifting gravity wells until the corridor belonged to them. Commander Vor entered the operations briefing room without announcement. Every chair filled instantly, no notes, no introductions. He stepped to the display terminal, keyed in his clearance, and let the room fall into complete attention. You've seen the data. You've heard the denial. He tapped a series of overlays. Logistics curves, gravitational obstructions, planetary refraction forecasts. They've read our silence as reluctance. Their fleets are waiting for sanctions. They believe we're deciding how angry to be. A slight pause. His jaw set. We don't measure loss by emotion. He keyed in the final overlay. A schematic of orbital lattice formation spreading from Rausch 3 to the Talveth Rim, with coded offshoots labeled for dark drop. Our doctrine does not assume neutrality can survive bloodshed. The moment they breached protocol, the framework collapsed. What's left is implementation. Someone near the back shifted. Vor didn't turn. This isn't justice, he said. This is continuity restoration. He stepped back from the display. We do not recover, he told the room. We remove. And then he left. Orders given. Direction set. Behind him, the Aegis line began its silent march. The sky over Talveth churned like boiling steel, heavy clouds convulsing in fractured spirals as the atmosphere struggled to process the sudden gravitational stress. Charged winds clawed at the outer hulls of Varn orbital towers, pressure flares triggering early warning alarms that echoed across the lowlands. Below, factory spires blinked yellow as guidance beacons failed in sequence, and thousands of Varn workers looked upward, eyes squinting against dust-caked rain, unaware that their world was already in siege. From orbit, the deployment pattern unfolded without theatrics. Terran ships exited blackout mode at staggered intervals, their profiles elongated and matte-coated to confuse radar reflections. They didn't broadcast demands. They didn't announce entry. They simply activated deployment clamps and began to work. The Dravik Fall and Reed's Array, both part of Earth's heavy support fleet, aligned on the planet's northern hemisphere, targeting orbital traffic control satellites. Microburst EMP shells were launched with exact trajectories, disabling systems in tight synchronized bursts. Talveth's defense architecture, designed for border skirmishes and piracy response, never anticipated a silent entry with no preliminary challenge. It took 4 minutes for their upper network to register a full black zone. 6 to lose contact with half their orbital grid. In the southern orbital quadrant, resistance emerged. Varn defense interceptors surged from hangar rings with boosted velocity, cutting toward the outer Terran arc. The Veripath and Holland Spire, 2 Terran cruisers running support net synchronization, found themselves flanked. The first hit was clean. An energy pulse struck Holland Spire's starboard wing, severing thrust control. The second came seconds later as internal containment ruptured. Vapor trails curled outward laced with debris, and a section of the mid-deck collapsed in flames visible from the upper stratosphere. The crew ejected stabilization pods, but only one beacon reported back. Veripath didn't hold much longer. A second Varn formation breached its port side, and within 90 seconds, the ship disintegrated along a rolling axis, hull fractures erupting like chain sparks. 400 lives gone. Vera watched the lost signal register with a barely audible click from his console. Dessen exhaled sharply behind him. 2 ships. Early. They were ready for something. They weren't ready for what we brought, Vor said, eyes unmoving. Elveth wasn't the objective. It was the lever. A keystone node along the Varn's industrial corridor. 3 orbital elevators connected Talveth's atmosphere to core resource satellites, where raw elements were harvested, refined, and distributed to 6 neighboring planets. Cutting Talveth crippled flow. It wasn't symbolic. It was anatomical. Board tapped the comm pad. Initiate full jammer spread. Reroute orbital bleed. Begin override of their comm lattice. Crash everything but emergency beacons. I want every exit vector flattened and every broadcast stripped of traffic control. The first wave of gravitational jammers activated. They anchored into the orbital bands and unfolded in synchronized clusters, creating compression nodes that distorted positional telemetry. Varn navigational systems began recalculating in loops, star charts redrawn mid-flight. Escape patterns collapsed into spirals. Freighters started to circle back toward planetary re-entry vectors. On the surface, pilot AI systems failed to plot reliable jump exits. One carrier skidded off its landing track and detonated near a supply depot, no shot fired. "Status on Talveth's uplink relay?" Vor asked. "Reassigned," replied a tech across the operations pit. "Satnet now under EarthNet tagging, 6 orbital cameras rekeyed, optical feeds looping by the second." The Varn still hadn't fully understood. They had deployed anti-ship systems around their capital towers, bristling with energy turrets and flak drones, waiting for an invasion. Waiting for boots. But none were coming. The ships didn't descend, they disassembled. They broke things that could not shoot back but could never recover. Power stations were disabled through delayed overloads, not blasts. Refineries were collapsed with deep penetration rods that melted foundational pylons without igniting fuel lines. Water towers were drained through siphons, redirected into overflow channels, saturating surrounding industrial zones and rendering transit routes useless. Satellites weren't destroyed. They were hijacked, repositioned, and made to rebroadcast Earth's own logistical instructions. With every feed corrupted, the Varn's internal networks became tools of their erasure. And still, not a single Terran squad touched down. "This is a civilian zone," a Varn tactical officer cried on a scrambled channel. "There are children in the outer colonies. You're disabling power, comms, food distribution. You can't just—" The line went dead. The Terran fleet had received orders before jump. Civilian zones were to be bypassed. No bombardments, no direct strikes, no occupation. Earth didn't need captives. It needed silence where structure once stood. Terran doctrine wasn't driven by conquest. It was driven by removal. On the northern arc, 3 Varn freighters attempted escape through a mid-orbit access gate. Earth's tracking pods intercepted their position with magnetic anchor arrays, pulling them into a drift loop that slingshotted their own momentum back into planetary orbit. All 3 vessels failed heat re-entry. Fire plumes bloomed across Talveth skies like burnt fabric curling in slow descent. Vor adjusted his collar and leaned toward the primary relay. "Triggered local blackout for all Varn satellite relays. If it's holding a signal above 0 joules, crash it." One of the younger tacticians hesitated. "Sir, that'll dump every channel they've got. Civil defense, flight control, medical." "That's correct." The screen showed the cascade begin 39 networks folding in less than 6 seconds. From orbit, the planet dimmed in stages, sector by sector, each light cluster flickering before succumbing to blankness. The sky that had once been riddled with relay beacons now showed only storm. Electrical discharges danced across cloud layers, veins of charged energy with no direction, no balance. "They used a broadcast to sever peace," Vor said, his voice clipped but steady. "We're using physics." He turned to the command board and keyed in the second cycle. Talveth was done. But it wasn't over. The kinetic rods deployed at different altitudes, aligned along independent orbital windows. No flares marked their descent. They didn't streak. They dropped. Dense alloy spears, dense beyond normal payload tolerance, released from orbit without ceremony. They weren't guided by visual telemetry. They were plotted by thermal bleed and energy memory. Records of where Varn installations had fired, even if they now appeared dormant. The first impact registered on Calanth 4, inside a subterranean bunker complex hidden beneath a grain refinery. The rod entered vertically, burrowing through 6 layers of reinforced stone and water shielding before detonating in a compact implosion that folded the structure inward. Debris did not scatter. It was crushed in. A silence followed so complete the surrounding plains vibrated with displaced air pressure before settling. 37 military personnel were lost. No civilians were within 6 kilometers. The second rod touched down on Revan's moon, where the Varn maintained a fleet resupply depot camouflaged beneath orbital drift mines. Earth's targeting data did not rely on visuals. Instead, it calculated electromagnetic inconsistencies in orbit and mapped them backward. The depot was struck mid-cycle. Storage tanks were obliterated, and the docked patrol ships shattered into irregular fragments. The lunar surface cracked outward, but the shockwave never reached the nearby worker enclave. Earth had mapped the blast radius first. The third hit landed on Hasker 12, a frozen colony with a surface command post linked to 3 tactical AI cores. The rod pierced the upper chamber, igniting internal systems and fusing the neural relays. The core didn't just shut down, it was forced to overwrite itself repeatedly, scrambling every stored tactic and corrupted response tree. Hasker's planetary defense protocols died screaming in silence. None of these strikes damaged residential areas. No buildings outside the intended perimeter collapsed. No hospitals were touched. Every target was functional. Every outcome was meant to be final. And then the broadcasts began. All across Varn-controlled territories, data networks glitched for a full second before stabilizing. Homes, stations, personal terminals, and public displays synced to a single loop. The footage of Halron Mech's assassination appeared. Raw, unfiltered, with no commentary. The sound of his voice, steady and unyielding, echoed through private homes and market stalls as he leaned forward across the negotiating table. Then the blade, then the fall, then the silence. The broadcast did not include blame. There was no attached rhetoric, just the image, just the moment that had ended Earth's negotiations. The symbolism wasn't editorialized, it was archived. And Calanth Prime, an engineer, dropped her tools as the video played overhead in the station workshop. Her knees gave out before the first loop finished. A pair of guards in the orbital command complex at Belhan District stood frozen, watching the footage loop again and again, their gloved hands trembling over console rails. On the agricultural sprawl world of Virax, farmers halted mid-field, faces turned toward silent monitors mounted above grain storage towers, stunned into paralysis by the clarity of the act. There was no attacker in sight, no invader pounding on city walls, no occupying force demanding tribute, just the footage, and then the world around it falling apart, system by system, node by node. Fleet command sectors lost control of their central core nurturing tables. Data traffic rerouted through Terran filters without their knowing. Subspace request calls began to time out. Some failed outright. Others returned scrambled registry data that listed long decommissioned ship IDs under false designations. The most brutal strike came when the communications AI on board the Varn Conviction, a heavy-class warcruiser docked near Riltar's belt, began to loop the assassination footage on internal morale feeds, then on command decks, then into encrypted fleet transmission headers. The footage embedded itself across every authorized console, interrupting power rebalancing, delaying response windows, and destabilizing route simulations. And still, Earth didn't arrive. The Varn had expected invasions. They had fortified choke points, mined gravitational wells, activated fail-safe defense lines, but no soldiers landed. No demands were shouted. Instead, everything they depended on to coordinate collapsed. Satellites shifted without being fired upon. Drones flew unresponsive. Logistical databanks read null values across energy reports. Memory cores, where strategies had lived, began to stutter and fail. Not by force, but through overridden identity. In the Varn High Seat's internal war council, arguments cracked wide open. Generals who once demanded unity in defiance now began to whisper doubts. If this was retaliation, where were the retaliators? If Earth wanted war, where were the warships? If this was punishment, why was no one speaking? What are they doing? Admiral Tekra spat across the table. Why aren't they finishing it? Why are they watching us come apart? No, replied Commander Valen, his voice gravel-thick. They aren't watching. They've moved on. This isn't a counterattack. It's administration. We are not being resisted, we are being written out. Then what do we do? Valen turned to the encrypted display hovering above the table, the broadcast footage still cycling behind the static. We stop pretending this is political. At Rausch 3, deep beneath Earth's Arctic crust, Commander Vor stood before the circular feedback matrix. 12 status relays pulsed slowly, each a confirmation beacon from the planetary zones recently struck. Transmission codes returned in sequence. Mech's footage had now reached all open relay clusters in Varn space. Its loop had penetrated 3 private council chambers. 2 Varn education archives had begun indexing the file before self-locking out. Feedback levels were optimal. Dessen entered quietly behind him, data tablet in hand. We intercepted a Varn consensus packet from Realtar Station. Looks like internal dispute. Some are calling for surrender. Others say we're trying to force regime change. Vor didn't turn. We aren't. Then what do we tell them? Nothing. He stepped forward and keyed the encryption confirmation into the transmission core. The entire upper display reconfigured, showing final verification for broadcast penetration. All target systems marked complete. Vor straightened his uniform, stepped back from the terminal, and looked to the projection. This is not punishment, he said, more to the room than the man behind him. This is standard operating procedure. The Cavalix corridor shimmered with overlapping energy trails, a growing lattice of motion where Varn ships struggled to align into coherent formations. Their capital vessels arrived first. Bulky, angular warframes reinforced with internal shielding and burst core drives, each one broadcasting overlapping command authority. Around them spiraled smaller cruisers, support cutters, and agile interceptors, all pivoting through the narrow corridor between Ivalar Rift and the Rion Drift Band. A natural bottleneck, and the only viable entrance into the Dominion's protected inner systems. Inside the Varn High Command Chamber, aboard the Verdict of Virex, debate fractured into chaos. "We must issue terms," barked Chancellor Dorvek, leaning over the table, eyes bloodshot and sunken. "If we acknowledge the strike and disavow those responsible, we may—" "We are past acknowledgement," snapped General Seldrix, slamming his gloved hand against the console. "Earth has taken 3 sectors. Entire fleets have gone dark. What exactly do you think they're waiting for?" "They're broadcasting nothing," Valen replied from the corner, his voice quieter than the others but unyielding. "No demands, no ultimatums. That isn't patience. It's planning." "They won't cross Cavalix," Selrix argued. "No ship can maintain stable fire control in this zone, not with the rift's interference. We can flank from the asteroids and strike through the lateral veil." Valen didn't respond. He only stared at the live combat readouts showing Earth's advance. Their ships hadn't fired a shot. They had entered the corridor in staggered patterns, deploying relay buoys that locked into orbit along pre-programmed nodes. The buoy lights didn't pulse, they blinked. Uniform intervals, matching the data rhythm embedded in Mech's assassination footage. The broadcast resumed. Across the corridor, on every Varn capital ship's primary display, the message overlaid silently. Diplomatic framework nullified, engagement rules terminated. Not a declaration of war, a classification update. Aboard the Aegis Concorde, Commander Vor watched the corridor unfold like a controlled spill. His fleet had positioned in silent intervals, bypassing the Varn's long-range scans by writing sub-channel noise generated by the rift's magnetic currents. Terran support cruisers moved laterally across the field, not in straight formations but in paired asynchronous curves. No 2 ships held the same angle twice. "Maintain full broadcast silence," Vor instructed. "Wait for local interference." Captain Rail, overseeing fleet coordination, narrowed his eyes at the staggered data. "They'll panic. They're already jittering on command confirmations. One bad pattern match and their entire AI net folds in on itself." "That's the point," Vor answered. "We aren't chasing a battle, we're forcing a collapse." At minute 23, the first Varn interceptor jumped the signal. It moved out of formation, fired a pulse beam toward the forward line of Earth's third vector wave. The shot didn't strike its target. It passed through the gap between two maneuvering vessels, struck a buoy, and detonated a relay shield that hadn't even activated. Within seconds, 3 more Varn ships opened fire. They weren't coordinated, their weapons misaligned due to shifting magnetic drag, and the beams cut into their own overlapping shield zones. One cruiser's reactive mesh fried on contact, and a support craft behind it ricocheted off an incomplete turn, spinning nose first into its own hull. Earth didn't return fire. Instead, the Terran formation changed direction. Not away, not forward, sideways. Vor's command grid reconfigured, adapting ship orientation to the corridor's irregular distortions. Each vessel rotated in relation to a data feedback curve broadcast from their trailing sensors. The result was a moving signal storm, a wall of noise, reflections, and echo feeds that scrambled Varn targeting indexes. The Dominion's tactical AI core began recalculating every second, and then every half-second. By the 6th recalibration, the predictive models failed. The Varn ships began mistaking Terran ghost signals for real targets. One destroyer turned too sharply toward a mirrored buoy feed and clipped its stabilizer pod. Its onboard AI reacted by shifting weight distribution into the path of its own escort wing. The resulting impact tore both vessels apart. Another cruiser attempted to flee backward out of the corridor, but it crossed into its own fleet's secondary shielding grid, triggering a feedback surge. Its systems overloaded, and in desperation the commander tried to reset power cycles. The ship's main reactor, already unstable from prior overload, ruptured. Back on the verdict of Virex, Chancellor Dorvex stared at the disaster unfolding in real time. "What is this?" he whispered. "They haven't fired a single round." Valen finally spoke again. "They're not attacking. They're rearranging physics until we don't function." In the upper command chamber of the Aegis Concorde, Vor stood alone at the central display, arms folded behind his back. His eyes traced the movement of each vessel, watching Varn ships cascade into themselves, like dominoes set against wind. He did not speak. The sound of tactical alerts filtered through the deck-clipped tones, warning indicators, movement notifications, but none of them registered panic. Earth's fleet continued in its curved sweep, like an orbital scythe clearing variables from a table. The buoy field restructured again, amplifying false return signals. 2 more Varn ships fired into overlapping ranges. A torpedo missed its target and drifted into a rear defense line. The impact set off a chain explosion that detonated secondary fuel cells on 3 interceptors waiting in low rotation. Vor watched it all happen. Still, he gave no order. He didn't need to. The Varn were unraveling themselves. All Earth had done was move quietly, let the signal speak, and wait. And as the Dominion crest, the Varn flagship, misread a refracted buoy feed as an incoming Terran surge and launched a spread of wide-range ordnance into its own defense ring, triggering the total collapse of its northern wing, Commander Vor turned toward his command crew with expressionless calm. "Mark collapse time," he said, "and adjust next vector phase." Then he turned back to the projection and kept watching. By the 32nd hour of contact, Earth's Aegis line shifted from containment into combat. The Varn, finally abandoning any hope of behavioral analysis or system confusion, activated full strike protocols across every surviving cruiser, and the corridor ignited with true warfare. It began with the Hollow Reach, Earth's oldest active vassal in the outer arc. Its stabilizers failed under dual-vector torpedo impact, both missiles, launched by different Varn squadrons who hadn't accounted for Terran shielding curves. The first breach opened the starboard array. The second tore through internal gravity regulators. The final broadcast from the command crew ended mid-word. Varn didn't pause to mourn. He issued a vector inversion command through the side lattice grid, and 12 Terran ships pivoted in a coordinated chain across 3 orbital bands. Echo curve targeting modules fired micro-thrust bursts that threw each vessel into sharp rotational paths. Varn's sensors, locked into forward-leaning predictive alignment, could not compensate for the lateral velocity shift. Their targeting algorithms misfired repeatedly. One even recorded an incoming ship as a non-combatant rock fragment until it was too late. But Earth paid for the maneuver. The Thorn segment lost its rear ventral wing during a rotation cycle. A faulty ballast relay failed to engage, and the resulting imbalance sent the ship drifting toward the outer collision ring. Before support could reorient it, a Varn heavy burst cannon found its core. The impact ruptured containment and ignited internal munitions. 7 minutes later, Balak Stand attempted to shield Cradlethorn from a concentrated drone cluster. It succeeded briefly, before 6 plasma harpoons shredded its shielding. The crew ejected partial pods, but orbital stress fractures shattered 2 on exit. One voice transmission cut through before blackout. "Do not mark us brave, mark us correct." Earth lost 12 ships in all, 600 crew. Each name fed directly into command memory. Inside the Aegis Concorde, auxiliary monitors began logging casualty identifiers, not by rank, not by class, just names, clean and unadorned. The scrolling list didn't stop. A quiet tone marked each update. No announcement, no dramatics, just cold, silent recognition. Rail approached Vor at the forward command tier, holding a clenched data. 41 lost in the last window, he said. Most from rear systems failure, some never made it to evac. Log the ships, leave the names, let the systems do the rest, Vor said, his voice sharper than before. The living need to function. Varn resistance thinned across the next cycle. Their AI networks, unable to repattern against Earth's momentum switching, began defaulting to error-handling protocols. Ships repeated evasive actions. Fire retrol arrays entered soft loops. One Varn destroyer locked onto a Terran signal that was no longer present and continued tracking its phantom until the ship drifted into a cluster of its own mines. The Dominion crest, barely operational and half-blind from internal flare damage, attempted to realign command orders. The bridge crew tried to reassert control through central uplink, only to find that their own targeting requests looped into Earth's buoy feedback. The system registered its own capital ship as an unknown and began defensive maneuvers against itself. 20 hours in, the corridor smelled of scorched polymers and compressed hydraulic fluid. Twisted fragments floated, rotating slowly. Inside Terran vessels, crewmen moved with practiced silence, avoiding questions they didn't want answers to. There was no cheer, only rhythm. Aboard the Verdict of Virex, the high seat of Varn stood among the scattered remains of his war council. One by one, his advisors had abandoned doctrine. Now he stood alone beside the primary comm station, sweat streaking his ceremonial collar, the weight of survival sinking deeper than the hull plating. His hands trembled as he keyed the diplomatic sequence. He input the reparation offer, zone clearance, territorial concessions. He didn't beg. There was no time for pride either. He transmitted everything in one packet, a final appeal. We acknowledge the death. We condemn the guilty. We offer corridor access, full indemnity, resource transfer, names, locations, identities. We offer our own. The reply came in seconds. No Terran voice responded. The console displayed a flat header. Signal classified as interference, entity state invalid. The Varn high seat stepped back from the terminal. The air in the chamber had grown still. Not warm, not cold, just quiet in a way that meant there was no further motion left to track. Inside Aegis Concorde, the message log flagged the appeal, auto-filtered it, and marked the packet as archived under closed-loop record. Vor didn't look at the screen. He was already coordinating the next orbital map phase. Rail watched him, eyes shadowed from strain. They just offered the corridor. They already lost it, Vor answered. What they offer isn't theirs anymore. The tactical map zoomed out. Varn ships registered fewer by the minute. Some had self-terminated navigation control. Others drifted with ruptured control systems. A few flickered with emergency beacons. Earth had flagged those for safe pass-through. The final step engaged without ceremony. Trajectory recalibration for withdrawal phase. No victory sound played, no external message broadcast. Earth had no anthem for silence. The Aegis line adjusted its orbit and continued moving forward. At 4:32 hours Coordinated Solar Time, Earth's Aegis line adjusted orbit and initiated the final subroutine. This phase wasn't about fleets or weapons. It wasn't about command posts or defense grids. It was about symbols, about identity. What remained of the Varn's public narrative, its self-pinch, its history, would now be stripped from the record. No ships landed in cities. No dwellings were entered. Civilian life was left untouched by design. But in orbit, one by one, Varn archival satellites began to vanish. Each contained cultural repositories, war memorial indices, council vote ledgers, and recorded bloodlines. Earth's operatives didn't detonate them. They replaced the indexing cores with zero-header null strings. Data deletion wasn't visible. It wasn't loud. The satellite shells remained intact, drifting quietly, but inside, everything had been overwritten with blank readouts. If recovered, the systems would boot without content. Every historical archive looped to startup screens. On public display towers, the towering bronze figure of High Chancellor Surlock, first leader of the unified Varn Accord, was brought down not with force but by frequency destabilizers implanted beneath its structural veins. It cracked under its own weight, collapsing mid-torso, its top half toppling forward in silence. Broadcasts showed civilians watching without interference. Earth didn't declare victory, it erased reference points. Flags were next. Drone teams deployed from the orbital ring carried retraction vectors. They didn't burn banners. They destabilized the banner-bearing platforms at structural weak points, causing the standards to droop, fall, and disappear into wind corridors. Every time the Varn tried to raise a replacement, their guidance anchors failed. The airspace around memorial sites was flooded with field disruptors that bent local current just enough to repel fastening mechanisms. Symbols would not hold, not physically, not digitally, not conceptually. But Earth's final directive didn't end with abstraction. On Iseth Prime, a Varn world known less for military function and more for legacy data preservation, Terran ground teams dropped into subsoil vault corridors. Their objective: recover the primary sequence ledger, the last intact command thread leading to the authorization of Mech's assassination. Intel suggested a surviving branch of the Varn's high protocol had attempted to bury the decision orders beneath layers of data obfuscation and fault-triggered collapse. Earth didn't need their confession. It needed proof. The insertion team consisted of 34 forward operatives, 6 logistics coordinators, 2 structural engineers, and a singular translation archivist. Descent occurred through magnetic drill shafts stabilized by counter-thrust nodes. The terrain was brittle. The vault sat between layers of fractured basalt reinforced with rebar lattice and thermal foam. Design choices meant to survive orbital attack, not internal breach. Captain Endar Voss led the descent. His voice cut through the comms as they dropped. Once we breach the inner chamber, do not separate. The subfloor's rated for older seismic layers. Any tremor hits, we collapse with it. They landed without resistance. The Varn had abandoned the site. All that remained were automated triggers. Earth bypassed them. Inside, the air was thick with pressurized minerals. The walls bled condensation from decades of deep-water leaching. As the engineers worked, a structural anomaly flagged across the top floor. Seconds later, the quake hit. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't sabotage. The foundation cracked in 4 vertical lines, groaning with the weight of its own secrets. A corner of the eastern tunnel caved in, collapsing on transport equipment. Warning sirens triggered through the comm line. Visibility dropped instantly. Earth's units scrambled to maintain footing as floor grading twisted under the weight of sliding stone. In the scramble to evacuate, 22 were crushed. 8 suffocated before backup teams arrived. 7 more perished from heat exposure when one of the data seal reactors failed and vented supercharged coolant. By the time the upper chamber stabilized, 200 Terran lives had been lost beneath the rock. But the ledger was recovered. Inside the reinforced container, wedged beneath the central archive pedestal, Earth's team found the final authorization code packet. It confirmed not only intent, but timing. The order had been issued 3 hours before the summit on L10V began. The blade had been drawn before Mech entered the room. Back aboard the Aegis Concorde, Commander Vor stood in the private chamber reserved for final archival clearance. The lights dimmed to preserve transmission integrity. The document hovered mid-air, streamed through direct relay, decoded in real time. The name signed at the bottom of the order wasn't the one the Varn had publicly blamed. It belonged to their central security advisor. A name Earth had flagged 6 cycles ago during border instability hearings. The evidence wasn't surprising, but it was now irreversible. Vor didn't speak. He keyed the file into encrypted memory. Not for the press, not for interstellar broadcasts, for Earth's record. Only. Transmission access required 5-level clearance and 3 Senate verifications. It was flagged with archival status only, not authorization for media use. Earth didn't need the galaxy's agreement. It needed the record to stand unchallenged. In the Earth-High Senate Command Hall, the final playback was streamed. No cheers, no arguments. One by one, the senators stood. Not to vote, not to speak, to witness. On the command floor of Aegis Concorde, Vor initiated the last operational directive. His hand hovered over the entry pad, the final protocol coded and waiting for confirmation. He pressed it. The tag appeared at the bottom of the command string. Continuity denied. The data transfer from Iseth Prime completed with a low confirmation tone inside the sealed command vault on Aegis Concorde. As the final directive logged into Earth's internal protocol database, no alert was issued, no headlines followed, no broadcast flickered across galactic news channels. The only entry added was a timestamp and one immutable label, Operation Continuity. Denied. Commander Vor stepped away from the console. The chamber's environmental lights dimmed as the protocol queue emptied, and every relay window across the fleet marked the operation as finalized. Units returned to standard formation. The order to disengage transmitted across 13 strategic channels, triggering the withdrawal cascade. Docking sequences initiated. Orbital buoys powered down. Earth's Aegis line began to fall away from Cavalix. No salutes, no statements, no commemoration. High above Accord Authority headquarters, a black-etched capsule pierced through the gravity lock with a synchronized boost. It had no ID tags, no emissary pilot. The capsule's casing was made of engineered obsidian, coated in magnetic-resistant alloy so it could neither be tracked nor intercepted without direct clearance. Inside it rested only one item: Halron Mech's diplomatic badge, still streaked with the dried trace of his final summit. There was no inscription, no accompanying declaration, no threat. Only a single access sequence embedded inside the casing, programmed to activate once it passed Accord security protocols. When reviewed, it would show unaltered footage, the assassination order recovered from Iseth Prime, and Earth's internal procedural map marked Echo 5, activation, verified. The capsule arrived silently and embedded itself into the Authority's external archive terminal, where it remained untouched for 3 cycles before the first internal directive was issued regarding its content. The Accord Council did not meet in full assembly. Half the seats remained vacant. No consensus vote was reached. No reparations were offered. Instead, Earth was classified as an absolute closure entity, a designation not seen in 200 years. The official reasoning: systemic execution of extrajudicial retaliation without committee consultation. Trade bans followed. Currency exchanges locked Earth's access to non-essential imports. Border agreements were suspended. Cultural embassies received recall orders. Half a dozen treaty organizations issued condemnations and open statements. Yet behind closed channels, several defense alliances discreetly upgraded their interoperability frameworks with Earth's command systems. The Council's public scorn was not reflected in the behavior of its militaries. Inside Earth's Senate chamber, a formal inquiry into Echo 5 activation was scheduled. The hearing was conducted without full attendance. The lead investigator opened by questioning Commander Vor's operational decisions regarding the initial deployment pattern over Talvath and the targeting of Varn data structures. Vor did not attend. Instead, the tribunal reviewed mission logs, read only memory records, and recovered Varn transmission data. Not a single log entry deviated from the established doctrine. Every action corresponded with standing orders. Every strike matched strategic elimination thresholds. No protocol breach was recorded. The inquiry failed to find fault. No censure was filed. No commendation was issued either. When the final ruling was logged, the Senate simply issued a revision to Earth's Foreign Bureau Engagement Charter. The revised language replaced 32 clauses of diplomatic procedure. The opening line was unaltered, but the closing sentence was new. Diplomacy requires structure. Betray it, and you forfeit continuity. The Varn Dominion did not reorganize. No provisional government emerged. There were no elections, no successions, no exiled movements to restore order. Their identity core was shattered, their command memory erased. Infrastructure remained, civilian settlements functioned, but no flags flew, no anthem played, and no single entity claimed representation on their behalf. Trade lanes rerouted, cartographers updated sector records. One by one, navigation systems replaced the Varn Dominion with blank mapping codes. They were not conquered. They were overridden. Back in orbit over Rosh 3, Commander Vor remained in position at the observation deck overlooking relay calibration sequences. The ship's system logged his presence every day without alteration. He submitted no new orders. His command staff rotated in shifts, handling post-section transitions and re-entry alignment protocols. One afternoon, Rael entered the deck without announcement. Earth Central forwarded an offer, he said. Seat on the Strategic Reform Council. Suggested compensation package. Promotion to Commandant. Vor didn't turn. Decline it. Rael waited a moment, then asked what many had wondered since the capsule launched. Do you think the Accord will try to retaliate? They won't agree on how. And if someone does, they'll have to explain why Earth didn't ask for territory, why we never raised a flag, why our fleets didn't land, why we didn't leave a governor, just a badge in a black vault. Rael looked away, unsettled. Was it worth 600 dead? Vor finally turned to face him. We didn't lose them in war, he said. We lost them in doctrine. The Varn didn't die defending themselves. They died believing Earth needed permission. Rael nodded slowly, then exited. Vor returned to the panel and input his final daily update. The screen displayed the operation header one last time before the archive permanently closed the command. Echo 5 concluded. The system logged his biometric signature and locked access. No override permitted. Earth issued no commemoration. No one marched. No one cheered. But every species, ally or not, understood the message. The Varn Dominion no longer existed, not through occupation or invasion, but through the application of doctrine. No further replies were sent. No negotiation resumed. Earth does not escalate, Earth closes. What would you have done if your diplomat was executed live on foreign soil? Retaliate or erase them from history entirely? Hit the subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories.